Margaret stood in the doorway of the grand library, her worn apron smoothed nervously with trembling hands. At 52 years old, she had cleaned enough wealthy homes to know her place. But today was different. Today, she had brought her granddaughter. Little Emma, barely 2 years old, clung to Margaret's shoulder with fierce determination. The child's golden curls caught, the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, and her pink dress, the nicest thing she owned, was slightly wrinkled from the long bus ride across town. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrison," Margaret began, her voice quiet but steady. "My daughter had an emergency at the hospital. She's a nurse, works the night shift, and there was no one else." Richard Harrison looked up from his mahogany desk, his blue suit perfectly pressed, his dark hair combed with precision. At 45, he had built an empire in commercial real estate. His office was his sanctuary, filled with leather-bound books and the scent of old wood polish. He was a man who valued order, routine, and silence. He studied the woman who had cleaned his home every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 years. Margaret had always been punctual, thorough, and invisible, exactly what he preferred in household staff. "It's quite all right," he said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his own voice. "Children happen, I suppose." Margaret set down her supply bucket and tried to lower Emma to the floor. The child immediately began to wail, her small fists clutching Margaret's uniform with desperate strength. "Hush now, sweetheart," Margaret whispered. Her weathered face creased with concern. "Grandma needs to work." "You can play right here with your doll." But Emma would have none of it. Her cries echoed through the usually silent house, bouncing off the high ceilings and expensive paintings. Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she tried again and again to settle the child. Richard watched this struggle with growing discomfort. He had never married, never had children. His life was meetings and contracts, numbers and negotiations. Yet something in the child's fear touched a place in him he thought had closed years ago. "May I?" he asked, standing from his chair. Margaret looked uncertain but nodded, exhausted from the morning's stress. Richard approached slowly, remembering how his own grandfather used to move around nervous, animals on their family farm, decades ago. He knelt down to Emma's level, his expensive suit creasing without concern. "Hello there," he said softly. "That's quite a grip you have." Emma peered at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Tears still clung to her lashes, but her crying had quieted to hiccups. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver pen, the one his father had given him before he passed. He held it out, letting the light catch on its polished surface. "See how it shines?" he asked gently. Emma's tiny hand reached out, then pulled back, still wary. "It's all right," Richard continued, his voice taking on a rhythm he didn't know he possessed. "I understand being careful. It's wise, actually. The world is big and strange when you're small." Margaret watched, barely breathing, as the millionaire she'd worked for in silence spoke to her granddaughter with such unexpected tenderness. Slowly, Emma's grip on Margaret loosened. Her curiosity was beginning to outweigh her fear. Richard set the pen on the carpet between them and sat back on his heels, waiting. The child studied him for a long moment. Then, with the sudden decision only toddlers possess, she slid down from Margaret's arms and picked up the pen. She looked at it, looked at Richard, and then, to everyone's amazement, walked straight into his arms. Richard froze, the small weight against his chest, the warmth of her little body, the trust in that simple gesture. It undid something in him he hadn't realized was wound so tight. His arms came around her automatically, protectively. Emma settled against him with a sigh, as if she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for. "Well," Margaret breathed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She hasn't done that with anyone but family. Not even my daughter's friends. She's been so frightened of everyone lately." Richard looked down at the child in his arms. Her breathing had already slowed, her body relaxing into sleep. The pink hair bow in her curls was coming loose, and without thinking, he carefully smoothed it back into place. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "she knows something we don't." Margaret began her work, but the day had already shifted into something neither of them expected. Richard found himself unable to return to his paperwork. Instead, he carried Emma to the blue velvet armchair by the window, his favorite spot for reading, and simply sat, holding her as she slept. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in a small town before the money came. His mother had worked 2 jobs, his father 3. He remembered being passed between neighbors and relatives, always feeling like an inconvenience, always trying to be invisible and good. When had he stopped being that boy and become this man? Isolated in his grand house, surrounded by things instead of people, Emma stirred in his arms and looked up at him with sleepy eyes. She reached up with one tiny hand and patted his cheek, as if to say, "You're all right. I trust you." Something in Richard's heart, something he thought had calcified years ago, began to soften and crack open. When Margaret finished her work, she found them by the window. Richard was showing Emma the garden outside, naming the flowers he'd never paid attention to before. The child was pointing and laughing, her earlier fear completely forgotten. "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to be so kind." Richard looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in 3 years. He saw the lines around her eyes, the gray in her hair pulled back in a simple bun, the dignity in her worn hands. He saw a woman who had raised children, weathered loss, and was now starting again with a granddaughter. He saw someone whose kindness had raised this trusting, loving child. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm the one who should be grateful. I'd forgotten something important today." She reminded me. "What's that, sir?" That connection matters more than accomplishment. That trust is earned, not bought. That the smallest gestures can carry the greatest meaning. He paused, then added, "Margaret, would you and Emma like to come to dinner sometime? Nothing formal, just company." Margaret's eyes widened, but she saw in his face that the invitation was genuine, born not from pity, but from a real desire for human connection. "We'd like that very much, Mr. Harrison." "Richard," he corrected gently. "Please call me Richard." As Margaret gathered Emma and their things, the child reached back for Richard, her small hands opening and closing. He came close and let her pat his face once more, her gesture of affection and approval. "Bye-bye," Emma said clearly, one of her few words. "Goodbye, Emma," Richard replied, his voice catching. "See you soon." After they left, Richard stood in his library, the silence returning but feeling different now, not peaceful, but empty. He looked at his desk, at the contracts waiting for his signature, at the life he'd built with such careful isolation. He thought of Emma's trust, given so freely once she felt safe. He thought of Margaret's quiet dignity and love. He thought of how a single afternoon had shown him what years of success never had, that wealth meant nothing without connection, that status meant nothing without compassion, that a grand house was just a building without the warmth of human kindness. The next Tuesday, Richard made sure to be home when Margaret arrived. He had purchased a small collection of children's books and a soft blanket. Emma came to him immediately, her arms raised, her face bright with recognition, and Richard Harrison, Millionaire, began to learn the greatest lesson of his life, taught by a poor maid and her granddaughter, who saw in him not his wealth or status, but simply a person capable of kindness. Sometimes the smallest hands hold the most powerful truths.